Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm really glad that you could be with me today as we continue our interview with Greg from the state of Washington. And if you were with us last week, you heard the first part of Greg's story. He was married for 9 years when his wife caught him in an affair. And Greg was hopeful that his marriage might be able to be saved, but as things unfolded, the situation was profoundly difficult and eventually led to the divorce and the loss of Greg's family. But Greg was radically committed to becoming a man of purity, becoming a new and different man with a new heart and a new way to manage his sexual gift. So this led to a new and difficult season in Greg's life because he's now a single man, a divorced man. He no longer has a wife or a marriage, but he's committed to sexual purity. And at the time of this recording, Greg has been divorced for 4 years, and I think he's pretty amazing because he's been doing something that very, very few single guys do, and that is that he has been honoring God with the expression of his sexual gift, and he has essentially been practicing sexual abstinence. So Greg is going to continue sharing his story with us in part 2 of this interview. So welcome back to the podcast. I trust that you will be blessed as you listen to this part of the interview. So thank you for being here. God bless you. And with that being said, we'll jump right back in to part 2 with Greg from Washington State. God bless you. How would you talk about, Greg? Is it fair to say, would you say that you had a sex addiction at this point in your life?
I've thought about that a lot, and I think even after going through several years until now of sexual addiction group work, I think you could call it sex addiction, but I think it definitely is much deeper than that. And personally, I think it was a pleasure addiction that started a long time before that.
And that's really where I'm going with my question. I wanted to ask you, what was the origin? Can you talk about, when did you start to struggle? Did you find porn when you were 10 years old? Were you sexually molested when you were 12? What did the birth of this struggle with sex look like for you that I'm assuming followed you through your adolescence into your young adulthood and then into your marriage? And then eventually into this affair.
Yeah. Well, so pleasure. I would wrap it all up into pleasure as the place that I would look to just feel better about myself for a long time, definitely all the way back to being a kid. And yes, I grew up in a Christian home. My parents taught at a large Christian university. My extended family was a part of that same large Christian university. And so the way that I put it together is to just understand the way that our family operated in the context of that university. And I want to be careful not to blame. That's really, I've kind of been through that, and that's not what I'm doing.
No, I appreciate that. There's a significant distinction when you push into your story, you understand your story, you're relating your story. It's not that you're trying to blame your parents, your family of origin, different things that happen. It's not that you're blaming, but it's just that it's your story and you're trying to understand what happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to shed light on the truth.
That's right.
That's the way I see it, and I think that's biblically what the Lord would have me do, and has had me do. So, So that was our world. Our family lived in campus. It was called campus housing. We didn't on campus. We were a mile away. But generally speaking, as a kid, just my perspective was, we have a family that works for an institution, and generally speaking, the institution kind of sets the rules for our life. They set the rules for dress code, whether it's school's in session or not. They set the rules for the music we listen to. They set the rules for what we do on Sunday, and so on. And so I'm not saying those things are necessarily bad, but just as a kid that grew from 4, 5, 6 years old up into adolescence, that's just what I perceived. And I know that my parents were sensitive to that, but as that translated into my life, I did not feel like I was necessarily safe to deal with just real life issues as they came up. I didn't have the tools to deal with them, and by deal with, I mean communicate effectively about how things were affecting me, even if they were dirty or messy or sexually related or whatever. I mean, I could barely even listen to a Michael W. Smith tape unless I was sneaking around under the house, because it was CCM, and CCM, Christian contemporary music, was considered bad. Let alone deal through my sexual feelings as an adolescent.
So it feels kind of like you're saying that there was this kind of pressure to fulfill this image, to measure up, to be the perfect Christian family, the perfect little Christian boy. You couldn't have any bad thoughts or feelings or actions. Just keep everything in. Just so it feels like it was almost, I don't know. I get the image of a mannequin. Just look good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think so. I felt the need to look good. Yeah. And I honestly don't know if that's specific to where I grew up, or if that's America, or human nature to look good. Maybe it was more so in my childhood, but I definitely felt image management as the priority. And so that's a long way to start the story, but generally speaking, I didn't know how to deal with life very well, and so I just started living a secret life, especially related to sexuality as a teenager, or a young teenager. In high school, in my sophomore year, I got expelled from high school. So as traumatic events go, that happened. I went to a public school for a year and definitely felt ousted from the people of God, or the safe Christian world. But I kind of liked it then. I was able to get out and go sow my oats and stuff. And then when that was over, I came back after that year was over. Still not knowing how to be a healthy kid necessarily. But just that dynamic of kind of being expelled, kicked out of that bubble, and then received back in for a time, seemed like it carried a lot of weight. So I finished high school in that Christian high school, and while I was there, my first romantic relationship developed, and over a course of a couple years, until I was a senior in high school, that same romantic relationship was like my priority. It was my first love. And when that ended, it ended pretty bad in a fairly traumatic way. And what I mean by that is that ended, and very shortly, within a week after that, my cousin was sexual with her. And she was my first sexual experience, that girlfriend.
Wow.
So that was when I lost my virginity. And as a teenager that still felt pretty down on himself, all mixed up, and just having lost my first romantic experience, having my cousin, who was also my best friend and grew up together, and somebody I looked up to, kind of take that from me, was probably the first feeling of real sexual trauma, and definitely what turned me back towards sexual pleasure to relieve it. So that would probably be the initial experience that I would point to that caused a lot of the addictive behaviors in my life. Yeah.
So at this point, you're beginning to learn to use sex and your orgasm, in a sense, to self-medicate.
Mm-hmm.
Using your word, pleasure.
Right.
Seeking pleasure. In the verbiage of the 12 steps of recovery, they talk about trading your FB for your FG. Trade your feel bad for a feel good. And so what can make me feel good the next 10 minutes? What can I do? I know what I'll do. And for so many of us, I know for me, my orgasm became my best friend. It became a way to make myself feel good, to experience some pleasure anytime I needed that dose of pleasure, in a sense, mm-hmm. to escape the reality of life, of the world, of whatever I might happen to be feeling at the moment, which much of the time pretty much sucked.
Yeah, I would agree.
So we learn to use our sexual gift and our orgasm in a pretty unhealthy way
over a long period of time. And I guess that my mind goes to a long period of time because, all the while you're experiencing life, and whether it's a breakup or whether it's, or maybe it's a high, maybe it's winning a sports game, or maybe it's graduating or something academic. Like for me, it always ended up being the go-to to just normalize, whether it was a high or a low, kind of like a centering way to slow myself down, and definitely find pleasure in it. So yeah, like learning, I mean, I wrestle with that now. I think human beings wrestle with how to cope with life in general.
Absolutely.
And I just think, just for dudes, it just seems like the more I talk to guys and the more I remember my own experience and see it now, it's so abnormal not to go to that, to cope with life. I mean, so for some people it's that in some way, some kind of sexual gratification and drugs and drinking and whatever your excess. But it's generally the same idea. And I guess biblically it's an idol type of a situation. And finding healthier ways to deal with life is a hard thing to do.
Right.
Especially for a kid or an adolescent that's growing into that extreme stage where their hormones are raging, and if they don't have tools emotionally and relationally to replace that coping,
it's something becomes embedded. It becomes a habit. We're scratching the same groove over and over, and pretty soon the groove is established, and
mm-hmm.
and it becomes a cycle that we're living in now. What did it look like for you, Greg? Can I ask? Was it pretty much masturbation? Was it pornography? Was it fornication? Being involved sexually?
Yeah. Yeah. So first it was masturbation. I remember just being in my bed and just finding myself, at 12 and 13 and 14, and noticing that it felt good to masturbate. And then from then on, from early teen years, right about 14 was the first time I viewed porn. I found some of my brother's porn downstairs, and it scared the heck out of me first. It was actually a traumatic experience, and so I didn't look at it for a while, but I definitely went back to it because it was so jarring, and I just wanted to see more. So it ended up being pornography and masturbation initially. From there, it was I became involved in with girlfriends, and I only had sex with one of my girlfriends, but touching and physical intimacy with them happened. But it was definitely never I actually never felt super safe with girlfriends. I was mostly safe with myself in that way. And so I think that was the total of it.
Did you think that when you got married, it would fix you? And how old were you when you got married?
Yeah, I was, how old was I? I was 24 when I got married. And I wanted to get married so I could have sex. I don't even know if I necessarily thought through the fact that it should be okay. I think I probably just assumed it would. I know that I never looked at it from her perspective. I never looked at it from the standpoint that, maybe she, as a woman that has her own body and her own thoughts and her own mind, maybe she doesn't always want to be my sex object. I never thought of it that way. So yeah, I guess I just assumed that having a wife meant that I could always have sex.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was super young, just having thoughts of having sex, maybe around puberty, and just dying to be married so that I could have as much sex as I could. I remember having crushes on adult women, maybe even teachers, and just yearning to be old enough to be married so that I could have this need met all the time.
Wow. So this thing follows you into your marriage, and you begin to act out on occasion. It wasn't just the sex part. You mentioned drugs, drinking, gambling, some different issues you're struggling with that are kind of disruptive to your marriage when your wife discovers these various ways that you're acting out. But then it escalates to the affair itself. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about that just a little bit? Were you and your wife just in a really bad place? Were you exceptionally vulnerable? How did you fall into the affair?
No, we were not exceptionally vulnerable. I think part of my cycle has always been when I'm at my peak, I am at my weakest, whether that's physically or professionally. When I'm doing really well, generally speaking, I'm probably the closest to messing up.
Wow, that's interesting.
And so at this particular time, it was spring, April, May of 2013. I felt I was super fit. I've always worked out, but I was doing well on physical goals. I had joined a new gym, and at that point too, I was still actually addicted to painkillers, and I had been for about 10 years. And when I think about that was a big deal, because one of the reasons that I had messed around with drugs in the first place was, of course, the pleasure, but also because of the social benefit. I've always wanted to be a people pleaser and a social guy, but I've always found it fairly difficult to be witty, I guess, and have the right perfect thing to say. And I had experimented with a lot of drugs, but painkillers, for me at least, took care of that problem really easily and quietly.
Made you more comfortable in your own skin.
Exactly.
So you could be more comfortable with other people, more social.
Right. Absolutely. And, now that prescription painkillers are all over the news, it's obviously how dangerous they are. And it was then too. I knew what I was doing. But since it had been so long getting off of those, I never thought I would actually get off of them because they had such a grip on my body. But the point I have there is I was definitely on those. I had been successful professionally, even in the church. I was doing some outward reaching things, ironically. And so I just felt good about myself. So I'm at this gym and I'm feeling confident. I'm feeling social. And I see this woman, and knowing that I'm married, I notice her and I let it stay in my mind over a couple of days. And then I notice that she's in the same place, each day that I'm there. And so I just kind of got right up next to her on a machine and started talking to her. And it's especially terrible just because I had always been a manipulator, and I would kind of stay back until I observe how to endear someone. And so I approached her in that way. I'd seen her with her kids, so I mentioned something about her kids, and then pretty quickly our conversation actually went to church, about church and about God. And I think about this a lot, and this is an especially significant part of it too, because we probably talked about our involvement in church for the first month and a half, because I would end up coming back to the gym at the same time in the morning, and we would talk. But we would talk about the clean stuff, quote unquote. We talked about church and family. And I even said that I was married, but that we were going through trouble, which was not true. And so I kind of painted this false picture of myself, the victim, but that I was a good guy, and that was kind of where everything started. So
it feels like over a period of weeks, you're literally developing a relationship with this person.
That's right.
So as these things go, one thing leads to the other, which leads to the other, and before you know it, you're in over your head.
Yeah.
And this thing goes on for a year, and then somehow you're busted. Your wife finds out.
Yeah, it was there for a year. And almost exactly a year later, actually, my wife was at my office, and just by chance, was looking at my desk at my office and pulled up a piece of paper, and it was a note that I'd written to the other woman. And it was, I can't even describe how hurtful that must have been for my wife, because it was some specific compliments about her that should have been directed to my wife. So she found that, and it wasn't even named. It was just words. And she asked who this was for, and I just remember feeling completely ghost-faced. And so I told her, and she was completely floored and surprised. And so she got up and walked out. The kids were with her on that day. Yeah, and so that was the blast zone. That's where it started, and I think it was just disbelief for her for the first quite a while.
Did you come clean at that point, kind of owning up to the whole year, the affair? Were you honest with her, or did you try to wiggle off the hook?
No, I wiggled for a while. I told her who it was for at that time, and then through several meetings with my pastor at that time, I owned up to the total, the time that I'd spent with her.
Full disclosure.
Right.
And so Did you and your wife try to work through it? Where do we go from here? What happened? Did you guys get through it?
No, we did not get through it. Our marriage, I completely tore our marriage apart, and so it failed. But the first, so we, I guess you could say, worked through until that point for a year. I remember the nights just being terrible, just questions and answers and confession and disclosure for me, and coming back almost every night with new details that I was giving about the affair, and even outside of the affair, more details about myself. And she waited. She waited to make a decision on what she wanted to do for a year. We separated pretty quickly. I moved out about a couple months later, but we did not get divorced until a year after that.
And it was right in that zone right there, not too long after she discovered it, that she gave you my name, and you end up getting on a plane to come to St. Louis. So where do we go from that part of the story? That point kind of invites you into this process of repentance. You begin to look at yourself, struggle with some things, trying to be more honest with yourself than you've ever been before. And really, that was kind of the beginning of a new journey for you. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, she gave me your number, and I took it from there. I came to see you, and I didn't know what to do after that. So I had connected with a counselor, a therapist here, and I knew I was going to see him when I got back. But I knew I also needed a group, some surrounding people, just connections. And so I think it was you that mentioned Celebrate Recovery while I was with you. And so I came back and looked it up and found a church right close to my house that offered Celebrate Recovery groups. And so I've been connected with that church from that point even until today. They offer a lot of different kinds of groups, but several of them are specifically focused on sexual purity.
That's awesome, because that's pretty unusual for churches in this day and age.
Yeah, they're an exception. They're awesome. They definitely take that on hook, line, and sinker, and embrace healing in that way. And I think after my experience with you, one of their groups is called the Conquer Series, and if I can plug the heck out of that, I totally would. For any church out there.
It's a video series about sexual purity. I have it. I've watched it. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's awesome. And one of the ways it's awesome, actually, is simply because it's visual, which speaks to a man's sexual nature, actually, because men are so visual with women. I kind of came to acknowledge that the fact that going through the Conquer series itself was so helpful and powerful for me just because it was visual. And I mean, I don't know if that's real or scientifically backed, but to this day, changes that were made in me with connections with other guys and continuing in the moment by moment repentance process and change, it just impacted on me, and it happened from then on.
Sounds like a pretty good theory to me. The whole thing about being visual, I mean.
Yeah, it was real.
So can I ask you, I'm picturing before and after, the old Greg and the new Greg. So now this metamorphosis is happening from the old Greg who used to keep secrets and who was struggling with all these things that began in his adolescence and followed him through life, into his marriage, into the affair. Now you're coming into the light, you're being honest, you're going to counseling, you're getting in a men's group. Can you just talk about that journey? What did it look like for you, this metamorphosis from the old Greg to the new Greg? The Greg that lived in hiding and duplicity and was coming out into the light, into honesty. And so this metamorphosis, this transformation is happening. So what has that looked like for you the past 4 years as you've been walking this journey? And guys, I hate to do it, but I see from the clock that we're out of time for today's episode of the Power of Purity podcast. So I'm going to have to jump in here and interrupt today's episode. But I do invite you to come back next week for what will be the final installment of our interview with Greg from Washington. And I think the question that I posed to Greg there is a very significant question. What did the metamorphosis look like from the old Greg to the new Greg? And as we end today's episode, he was talking about the loss of his marriage and his family, which of course was very tragic, and we know that sometimes there are significant consequences to the decisions and the choices that we make in our life. And I know that myself, and I think many guys that have listened to this podcast, have reaped those consequences because of their struggle with their sexual sin. But one of the cool things about God is that He doesn't waste our pain. And sometimes when we are at the very lowest, most broken, and darkest place in our life, it creates a tremendous opportunity in the economy of God's kingdom for us to shift from our path onto God's path and finally begin to pursue God and to seek God in a deeper, more desperate way than we ever have before. And I think that's exactly what happened in Greg's situation. And we're going to hear more about that next week. And one other thought occurs to me, and I think I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but it's very dark and difficult, and it's hard to hear about a guy getting caught in a situation like this and the resulting consequences. But again, in the economy of God's kingdom, there's something very beautiful about getting caught. And it turns out to be such a gift for so many of us who have been struggling in secrecy and duplicity with our sexual sin. Because getting caught, in a sense, kind of forces a guy out into the light. It forces him into a position where he has to become more honest with himself, more honest with others, more honest with God, maybe than he's ever been before. And it creates this unique opportunity for him to begin to deal with these issues that he hasn't dealt with for all these years because he's been too scared, he's been dishonest, he's been in duplicity, he's been in the dark, but now finally he's coming into the light, and this creates an opportunity for him to finally deal with some things that are way overdue. And that's what we're going to learn exactly happened for Greg. So please come back next week. I think you'll be very blessed to hear the conclusion of his story and the remarkable progress he's made as a man of purity for the past 4 years since his divorce. So God bless you guys. Thank you for being here today. I'll look forward to seeing you next week. And until then, be blessed, have an awesome week, have an awesome day, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.